The soldiers had been inside the horse for hours. No light, no sound but their own breathing, the wood pressing against their armor, the smell of sawdust and sweat, and the particular silence of men who know that one cough, one shifted foot, one whispered word means death for all of them. And then, the gates opened. That is the story. That is the image burned into the foundation of Western civilization. Every child learns it. Every military strategist cites it. Every cybersecurity professional named a category of malware after it. The Trojan Horse. The greatest trick ever pulled. There is just one problem. There is no archaeological evidence it ever happened. No physical trace of any kind. No carving, no painting, no fragment of pottery, no line etched in stone or clay. 3,000 years of human civilization have been citing a military strategy that exists only inside a poem, written 400 years after the war it describes. The horse is not a simplified version of the truth. It may not be a version of the truth at all. But here is what did exist. What the burned walls and unburied bones of northwestern Turkey actually hold. What the Hittite diplomatic records actually say. What the dirt, which does not lie and does not write poetry, actually shows. The real story of how Troy fell is older, stranger, and in every way more unsettling than the horse. And once you see it clearly, you will never hear the word Troy the same way again. There is a city buried under a hill in northwestern Turkey. Archaeologists call it Hisarlik. The ancient world called it Troy. And when excavators finally started digging in the 1870s, they expected to find proof. Proof of the greatest military deception in human history. Proof of the horse. They found walls. They found weapons. They found ash and bone and the unmistakable signature of violent destruction. They found a city that had, without question, burned to the ground. But they did not find a horse. Not a carving, not a painting, not a single pottery fragment depicting a giant wooden structure filled with soldiers. Not one inscription. Not one contemporary account written anywhere near the time the events were supposed to have happened. In a civilization that documented its wars obsessively, on walls, on clay tablets, on ceramic vessels, the most famous military trick in human history left absolutely no physical trace. Think about that for a moment. We have Egyptian hieroglyphs describing battles from 3,000 years ago in extraordinary detail. Troop counts, casualty figures, the names of enemy commanders. We have Hittite diplomatic records referencing a coastal city called Wilusa, a name linguists widely accept as the Hittite version of Ilios, one of the ancient names for Troy, in formal political treaties. We have Mycenaean Linear B tablets cataloging weapons, ships, and military inventories with the dry precision of government paperwork. These people wrote everything down. Everything. And yet, nothing about the horse. Not a rumor, not a fragment. Not a single line etched into stone or clay that says,
"Enjoying the story so far? Subscribe to Untold History and keep discovering the past they never told."
And then we built a horse and hid soldiers inside it and waited in the dark. The silence is not a gap in the record. It is a void. Manfred Korfmann, the German archaeologist who led the most comprehensive modern excavations of Hisarlik, found overwhelming evidence that Troy 7, the layer corresponding to the traditional Trojan War timeline, was destroyed by catastrophic fire around 1180 BCE. Burned buildings, weapons embedded in walls, unburied human remains scattered across the ruins, which means people died where they stood, and there was no one left to give them a proper burial. There was conflict. There was a siege. There was real, documented, physical destruction. But what Korfmann's team did not find across decades of meticulous excavation, was any archaeological evidence of a wooden horse. No structural remains consistent with a large wooden construction outside the walls. No iconographic record inside the city celebrating or depicting it. No defensive modifications to the gate consistent with something large being dragged through. A civilization burned. A war was fought. Something catastrophic happened at that hill. And the most famous detail of the entire story, the detail every child learns first, simply does not appear anywhere in the dirt. Which means someone added it later. The question is, who? And why? And how a single poetic invention managed to replace the actual historical record so completely that the entire world stopped asking for the evidence. Here is the uncomfortable part. The horse is not a minor detail. It is the whole story. Remove it, and the Trojan War becomes what it most likely actually was. A regional Bronze Age conflict over trade routes and territorial control, fought by civilizations that no longer exist, documented imperfectly in the records of their enemies. Important, fascinating, but not legendary. The horse is what made it legendary, and the horse may never have existed. But to understand how the deception worked, you first have to understand what it replaced. Here is the version you know. It is the final year of a 10-year siege. The Greeks are exhausted. The Trojans are exhausted. The walls of Troy have held for a decade, and no army on earth seems capable of breaching them. Then Odysseus, the cleverest man in the Greek camp, comes up with a plan so audacious it should not work. Build a horse. A massive wooden horse. Hide your best soldiers inside. Leave it on the beach as an offering to the gods. Sail away. Make it look like you've given up. The Trojans wake up the next morning. The Greek ships are gone. The camp is empty. And there, sitting on the sand like a gift from the heavens, is this enormous, magnificent structure. They argue about what to do with it. A Trojan priest named Laocoon warns them. He throws a spear at the horse's side. He begs them not to bring it inside the walls. The gods, siding with the Greeks, send 2 giant sea serpents to silence him, crushing him and his sons to death on the beach as a warning. The Trojans interpret Laocoon's death as divine punishment for his disrespect. They tear down part of their own wall to drag the horse inside. They celebrate their apparent victory. They drink. They sleep. And in the middle of the night, the Greeks slip out. They open the gates. The fleet, which had only sailed around the headland, returns. And Troy burns. It is a perfect story. It has hubris and divine intervention. It has the clever underdog outwitting the powerful defender. It has dramatic irony, the audience knowing something the characters do not. It has a twist ending that feels both surprising and inevitable. It is, in every structural sense, a masterpiece of narrative engineering. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, composed around the 8th century BCE, gave the Western world its foundational mythology of heroism, war, and fate. For centuries, these texts were treated not as literature, but as history. Roman generals studied them as military manuals. Medieval scholars cited them as eyewitness accounts. Even Heinrich Schliemann, the 19th century archaeologist who literally went looking for Troy with a copy of Homer in his hand, believed he was following a documentary record, not a poem. The story was taught in schools, painted on the walls of palaces, carved into marble, referenced by philosophers, generals, and emperors as proof that deception, when executed with genius, could bring down the mightiest walls. The world did not just believe the story of the Trojan horse. The world built its understanding of strategy, of war, and of human cleverness on top of it. And that is exactly what makes the next part so unsettling. Because the story is almost too perfect, too clean, too satisfying. Real history is messy. Real wars are decided by logistics and weather and disease and the slow, grinding attrition of men and resources. Real victories do not hinge on one brilliant trick that works exactly as planned. But this one did. Or so we were told. The version we inherited was not written by a soldier who fought at Troy. It was not recorded by a scribe who witnessed the horse being built. It was composed by a poet, or a tradition of poets performing under a single name, working 4 centuries after the events. 400 years of oral retelling, cultural drift, and artistic embellishment standing between the original war and the version that became gospel. The story felt true. It was emotionally satisfying. It was easy to remember and even easier to repeat. And so the world repeated it, for nearly 3,000 years, without once asking for the evidence. Homer was not a war correspondent. This is the fact that changes everything. And yet it is the fact that almost no one mentions when they retell the story of the Trojan horse. The Iliad and the Odyssey were composed approximately 400 to 600 years after the events they describe. To put that in perspective, imagine someone today writing a detailed, dramatically rich account of the fall of the Western Roman Empire, from memory, through oral tradition, with no surviving documents to check against. That is the temporal distance between Homer and Troy. 4 centuries of retelling, cultural drift, political revision, and poetic embellishment standing between the poet and the events. And Homer, if Homer was even a single person, which classical scholars debate to this day, was a poet. His goal was not accuracy. His goal was meaning. The first crack in the story appeared when linguists began examining the original Greek text with fresh eyes. The word Homer uses for the horse, hippos, does mean horse. But in ancient military contexts, hippos was also a common metaphor. Siege engines, the massive battering rams used to break city walls, were frequently built in the shapes of animals, with hardened metal heads mounted on wooden frames. They were called by animal names: the ram, the tortoise, the horse. Dr. Armand Dangour, professor of classics at the University of Oxford, has argued in academic publications that what Homer described as a wooden horse may have been a siege engine, a battering ram or covered assault structure that was mythologized over generations of oral retelling into the literal giant horse of popular imagination. A machine that broke through Troy's walls became, across 4 centuries of storytelling, a machine that was invited inside them. The mechanics of the myth shifted, but the word stayed the same. And there is a second interpretation, even more disruptive. The ancient historian Pausanias, writing in the 2nd century CE, suggested that the Trojan horse was not a land vehicle at all. It was a ship. Specifically, a large Greek warship with a horse's head mounted on its prow, a standard naval decoration of the Bronze Age period, used to transport soldiers to a concealed landing point while the main fleet staged a visible retreat along the coastline. 2 completely different objects, both called the horse, both historically plausible. Neither of them a giant hollow wooden statue filled with men crouching in the dark. But the deepest crack in the official story is not linguistic. It is logical. The story requires the Trojans to make the single most catastrophically stupid decision in military history. These were not naive villagers. These were a sophisticated, battle-hardened civilization that had successfully defended a walled city for 10 years against the greatest military force the ancient world could assemble. 10 years. Against everything the Greeks had. And then, on the morning after the Greeks apparently abandoned the siege, these same people, who had spent a decade watching every Greek move with lethal vigilance, decided to drag an enormous, unidentified wooden structure left behind by their enemy directly inside their own walls. No inspection, no hesitation, no basic military caution. The one man who warned them was killed by sea serpents, which they interpreted as a sign from the gods that bringing the horse inside was the right decision. This is not a story about human cleverness. It is a story about human stupidity on a scale so extreme it strains every boundary of believability. And yet for 3,000 years, the world accepted it without question, because Homer told it beautifully, and beauty has always been more persuasive than logic. The official story had the crack built into it from the beginning. We just never looked closely enough to see it. The archaeological record of Troy is not silent on violence. It is very loud. Troy 7, identified by Korfmann's excavations at Hisarlik as the most probable layer corresponding to the Trojan War timeline, shows clear evidence of violent destruction around 1180 BCE. Burned buildings, arrowheads and spear points embedded in walls, unburied human remains found inside the ruins, suggesting people died where they stood, with no one left to bury them. But here is what Korfmann's team also found. Evidence of a long siege. Infrastructure built for a city under sustained military pressure. Expanded lower city walls. Water supply systems designed to support a population cut off from outside resources. Storage facilities consistent with years of rationing. The BBC, in its coverage of the Korfmann excavations, noted that the physical evidence is entirely consistent with a prolonged military siege that ended in catastrophic assault and fire. Consistent with armies breaching walls by force. Consistent with battering rams driving through gates. Not consistent with a city that voluntarily opened its own doors to drag in a wooden gift. The dirt does not lie. And the dirt says, this city was broken from the outside, not tricked from within. And this is where it gets interesting. The Hittites were the dominant power of Anatolia during the Bronze Age. They kept meticulous diplomatic records. And in those records, excavated from their capital Hattusa, there are references to a western coastal city called Wilusa, a name linguists widely accept as the Hittite rendering of Ilios, one of the ancient Greek names for Troy. There is a Hittite treaty document, the Alexandru Treaty, dating to approximately 1280 BCE, which mentions the king of Wilusa by name and describes the city as a vassal state with its own political identity and military obligations. This is not mythology. This is...
Enjoying the story so far? Subscribe to Untold History and keep discovering the past they never told.
Diplomatic paperwork. And the Hittite records describe conflicts in the western Aegean region in the language of real geopolitics. Territorial disputes, trade route competition, coalitions of sea peoples destabilizing the entire eastern Mediterranean. The kind of multi-year, economically motivated military campaign that ends with siege engines battering down walls, not sea serpents and wooden horses. Homer took that war. The messy, bureaucratic, economically motivated real war, and he made it sing. The question is, what he had to remove to make it beautiful. Here is the moment no one wants to say out loud. The Trojan horse may have never existed, not as myth, not as metaphor. As the thing itself, the giant hollow statue, the soldiers crouching in the dark, the gates opening from the inside at midnight, it may be entirely fictional. A poet's invention. A story so perfectly constructed that 2,800 years of human civilization decided to call it history. And no one questioned it. Because it felt true. Because we wanted it to be true. Because a war ending with a clever trick is a story worth telling. A war ending with siege engines and starvation and the slow collapse of supply lines is just a war. Every Roman general who cited it as strategic inspiration, every medieval scholar who taught it as documented fact, every cybersecurity professional who named a category of malware after it. Every child in every classroom who learned the words Trojan Horse as a universal synonym for brilliant deception. All of them. For 3,000 years. Carrying a story that may have no more physical reality than the sea serpents that silenced Laocoon on the beach. The lie was never hidden inside the horse. The lie was the horse. And we built the world's understanding of deception on top of it. This matters today in ways that are deeply uncomfortable. The phrase Trojan horse is embedded in the foundations of Western strategic thinking. Military academies teach it. Political analysts use it to describe legislation with hidden agendas. Philosophers cite it as the defining example of deception through trust. And cybersecurity professionals named an entire category of malware after it. The Trojan virus. A program that disguises itself as something safe to gain access to a system from the inside. The concept is so fundamental to how we think about deception that we built an entire modern vocabulary around a story that may never have happened. But the deeper problem is not the horse itself. The deeper problem is what the horse reveals about how human beings construct history, and how effortlessly a beautiful story displaces an inconvenient truth. Homer's epics were composed in an oral culture. Stories were the technology of memory. They were designed to be emotionally resonant, structurally satisfying, and easy to transmit across generations. The best stories survived. The complicated, ambiguous, bureaucratically accurate ones did not. Real wars fought over trade routes and territorial control do not survive 3,000 years of retelling. Wars fought over love, honor, and divine punishment do. And so what survived the Bronze Age collapse, that catastrophic civilizational unraveling around 1200 BCE that destroyed nearly every major power in the Eastern Mediterranean simultaneously, was not the administrative record. The Mycenaean palace system collapsed. Linear B writing, the script used by the Greeks of Homer's era, was lost entirely for centuries. The actual historical memory of what happened at Troy vanished along with the civilizations that had lived it firsthand. What filled the vacuum was Homer. And when a brilliant story fills a historical vacuum, it does not present itself as a story. It presents itself as truth. And once a story becomes truth, once children learn it in schools, once generals cite it in strategy rooms, once its very vocabulary enters the language itself, it becomes almost impossible to dislodge. Because to challenge it is not just to question a fact. It is to dismantle something people have built their entire understanding of the world upon. We are still living this pattern. Right now. Today. Every time a powerful narrative replaces documented evidence, in politics, in the news, in the stories nations tell about their own origins and wars and heroes, the Trojan horse is being built again. Not from wood, from words, from repetition, from the deeply human preference for a story that feels true over a record that actually is. The Greeks may have won with siege engines and superior naval coordination, and the slow, grinding attrition of a decade-long military campaign. That story is real. It is supported by the physical evidence in the dirt of Hisarlik. It is consistent with the Hittite diplomatic records. It is the version that survives every form of serious scrutiny. It is also deeply unglamorous. It does not make for poetry. It does not echo across 3 millennia. And so it was replaced by a horse, by soldiers in the dark and gates opening at midnight, and a city burning because it trusted what it should have questioned. That forgetting did not happen by accident. It happened because no one was paying close enough attention, and because the story was just too good to doubt. There is something almost beautiful about it. A city burns. A civilization collapses. Centuries pass. The people who fought at Troy are dust, their names erased, their reasons forgotten. And then a poet, blind according to legend, which may itself be a myth, reaches back across 4 centuries of silence and gives it all back. He gives it back with gods and monsters, with a woman's face launching 1,000 ships, with a wooden horse and soldiers in the dark, and walls falling in the night, and a priest screaming on the beach that no one listened to. He made it matter. He made it last. And maybe that is the most human thing of all. We cannot bear for things to simply end. We need the ending to mean something. We need the walls to fall for a reason that feels worthy of the suffering, not trade routes and siege engines and the slow rot of a decade-long military stalemate, but love and hubris and the wrath of gods who choose sides and punish those who ask too many questions. Homer did not distort history out of malice. He preserved it the only way his world knew how, in the container that human beings have always used to carry what they cannot afford to forget: a story. But here is the question that stays with you long after the horse has been dragged inside the gates. If we got Troy this wrong, if we turned siege machinery and naval tactics and a geopolitical trade war into a literary monument that the entire world accepted as documented history for nearly 3 millennia, what else are we carrying? What other stories have we mistaken for history? What other gaps have been filled not by evidence, but by the most emotionally satisfying narrative available? What other horses are we still dragging through our own walls, voluntarily, gratefully, absolutely certain that we are the clever ones and not the ones being deceived? The answer is not comfortable. Because the pattern did not end with Homer. It never ends. Every generation inherits a set of stories it calls history, and a set of questions it has been quietly taught not to ask. The horse changes shape. The walls change name. The poet changes language. But the mechanism stays exactly the same. A story fills a vacuum. The story becomes truth. The truth becomes identity. And identity, once threatened, does not go quietly. Troy burned because its people trusted a beautiful object more than they trusted their own judgment. Laocoon warned them. He threw a spear at the thing. He stood on the beach in front of everyone and told them exactly what it was. They let the gods silence him. Which is another way of saying, they found a reason to ignore the warning they most needed to hear. We still do this, every single day. The next time you encounter the official version of a story, clean, satisfying, too perfectly shaped to question, remember the horse. Remember the priest on the beach. Remember that the warning came before the gates were opened. And ask yourself, which side of the walls are you standing on? Speaking of stories the world accepted without question, next time we go even deeper. An entire civilization, marked on old maps, referenced in historical documents, spoken about for centuries as though it were established fact. A civilization that, according to the mainstream historical record, never existed at all. Next, the lost civilization of Tartaria. Fact or fiction? The answer is far more complicated and far more unsettling than either side is willing to admit.